Hi, I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review, and we couldn't be happier to host the 4th Annual Insight Jam. I want to thank everyone who's participating this week, as well as our Insight Jam sponsors, DataStax, Monte Carlo, Denodo, High Gear, and Seller Data. I also want to thank our Solutions Review editors and staff for pulling this event together. When we started this in 2019, we wanted to take a moment at the end of the year to celebrate enterprise technology with a social media event offering best practices and predictions. This will be our biggest jam ever, including 16 live-streamed expert panel discussions over 4 days. And we intend to keep the insights flowing in 2023 with the launch of an expert subscription site for any tech professional who wants to publish posts on Solutions Review. Again, thank you all for being here and enjoy the Insight Jam.
Solutions Review presents Insight Jam, a social media celebration of enterprise technology. Hello and welcome back to the 4th and final day of the Insight Jam. I'm Jonathan Paula, the Director of Multimedia here at Solutions Review, and I'll be serving as your host and MC for today's activities as we discuss business intelligence for 5 hours of live-streamed panels, the first of which starts right now. Cloud Data Architecture's Best Practices for Managing, Analyzing, and Governing Data in the Cloud. I have a great group with me here. Let me bring them all in, led by our moderator, Philip Russum. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. A pleasure to have you here. Philip, we're going to let you kick us off with introductions. 60 seconds or so. Tell the audience a bit about yourself and what excites you about today's topic. And good luck.
I'll go first here. And in fact, members of the panel, you got an email with all our names listed in a very specific order. So most of the time today, I will follow that order. It's just that at the beginning, we'll start at the top, and then we'll start with the second guy and work our way bottom back to the top, etc. So we mix it up a little bit. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then Mark, Slava, Anil, Gary, and Tom, you follow me. So my name is Philip Russum. I've been an industry analyst for decades, and I've worked for all the big industry analyst firms, Gartner, Forrester, Giga Information Group, which was a spinout from Gartner, the Hurwitz Group. I was a research director at the Data Warehousing Institute for years as well. And a lot of my experience has been in data warehousing, data integration, and the architectures that go with that. So today we're going to look at large-scale data architectures of a variety of types, and it'll be really exciting to hear what various members of the panel have been working with, because a large data architecture has a lot of components to it. It'll be great to hear what they're all doing. So panelists, let's start with Mark. And Mark, just tell us briefly, just a bit about your background, what kind of work you're doing recently, and what your employer has to offer.
Well, thank you very much. My name is MarkDiamond. I'm president and CEO of Contoro. We're the largest independent provider of information governance consulting services, working with more than 30% of the Fortune 500, plus many mid-sized and smaller organizations. We do everything from privacy, records management, litigation readiness, employee collaboration. We help large organizations develop and marry policies and strategies with technology and help them do that on an enterprise-wide basis. I'm excited about today's discussion because I think that 2023 will be a significant challenge for data architectures. There's a host of new privacy and other requirements coming out, and the old way of doing things may get some organizations into trouble, and I think companies have to take a smart approach about how they grapple with some of these new requirements.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And let's just move on to Slavic.
Hi, my name is Slava Kozlov. I'm Senior Vice President of Engineering, Operations, Product Development at a company called Privacera. At Privacera, we're in the business of data governance management. Basically, we're looking at heterogeneous data sources and how we can allow access to the people that should have access to the data and not allow access to people who should not have the access to that data. We're also dealing with discovery of data itself to see what is the proprietary, what is confidential, what shouldn't be granted access to, etc. And finally, we can encrypt and obfuscate the data as well. I've been in the cybersecurity business for over 20 years now with companies such as VeriSign, Symantec. I was the CTO of SafeNet. And most recently, I was with Sky High Networks, which was acquired by McAfee. We're a leader in cloud access security brokerage business. So that's all about me.
Well, thank you. Next up is Anil.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here discussing one of my favorite topics, been in the data business for around over 20 years now. And I'm the VP of Data Solutions at InstaCluster. It's a 10-year-old startup focused on open source data platform. We were recently acquired by NetApp, so technically I'm part of NetApp now. We're still integrating. As I said, I have been in the business for over 20 years. Last 5-7 years, I've focused on cloud also, so cloud and data. I have implemented full lifecycle data solutions all the way from strategy to architecture, obviously, development, implementation, and finally supporting those systems as well. That's about me. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. Let's move next to Gary.
Yeah, awesome. Nice to be with you here, Philip. So I'm Gary Hegmiller. I'm CEO of Archeon Labs. And at Archeon Labs, we're in the business of moving data. Specifically, we use the most modern form of change data capture, specifically designed for people who are going to either use some sort of a cloud application or some hybrid, they've got their own data center or a cloud sort of thing. To basically migrate or replicate data from transactional sources into places where people can consume it for applications or data warehousing thing. And the reason why I'm here is my background. I've spent 20 years in software. Last 10 of it was selling machine learning and AI applications to large banks and government agencies and things like that. And the thing they always wound up struggling with was getting data, operational data in real time to the machine learning models or applications where they needed to consume it, right? It always was this cumbersome process that didn't wind up working particularly well. And so, as I came along and discovered Archeon and realized, wow, this solves all the problems, it became kind of a no-brainer. So really looking forward to chatting a bit about data architectures and how people can move themselves into the modern world.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. And then finally, let's hear from Tom Nett.
All right, thanks. I'm more concerned about Anil's pictures behind him because those are my 4 favorite movies. So I'm excited about that. Tom Natt's been doing this for 25 something years. Data warehousing, ETL, all that good stuff. I work for a company called Starburst, so we're the enterprise arm of Trino, which was created at Facebook about 10 years ago now, and it was created to replace Hive, so a high concurrency SQL engine at the time. We kind of moved into getting into data processing and more of like moving data around. And then we have a lot of different connectors. So like 35, 40 different kind of connectors. So data federation. So joining the data wherever it lives or moving the data out for a high concurrency BI cluster. So I'm excited just to talk about what is going to happen next year because I just want to reinvent and there's some main themes out there, but nothing is like machine learning kind of died down a little bit. Now I'm waiting for something exciting to either be really cool or us to just jump into. So I'm interested to see what everybody else has to say.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I'll just comment. Wow, we have a wide range of experiences, wide range of skills here today. So it'll be really interesting, especially as you guys start to compare notes with each other. And yeah, I am going to follow through in a certain order. But if you want to pop in and make comments on what somebody else is saying, that kind of stuff, feel free to do that so we get some interaction going here as well. Well, let's move on to our first topic of discussion. And when we do that, we'll start with Slavic. He'll have the first response, followed by Anil. And then I'll just call names as we go after that. But the first topic, it has to do with how do you define data architecture? And another way to put it is when somebody says architecture to you, what's the first thing you think about? Because there's a lot of things to think about. If you look inside a specific data architecture, it's got a lot of components. And a lot of times people automatically think of the layer of the architecture or the area where they do a lot of their work, or you may think of areas that your employer has products and services for, that kind of thing. So everybody's got their own idea there. In my brain, when I think of data architecture, I'm unusual. I immediately think of the data. And a lot of times people forget that that's the whole point of a data architecture, is to bring data together, just the right collection in the right condition to support very specific use cases and so forth. And a lot of other people, well, they'll think of their software portfolio and they go, oh yeah, we bought this and that vendor product and we've implemented them and we make them integrate. And, our architecture is whatever it takes to make these products work together. And that's, I think of that as more of a systems architecture, not really a data architecture. But the last thing I'll say here before we hear from Slavic is that I find that there's rarely one architecture. You often see multiple architectures work together. Like a lot of my background has been in data warehousing. Well, the data warehouse has to have an architecture or it's just not going to work. But you also depend on data integration, and it should have an architecture. And those two architectures, they don't stack like technology stacks. They fit side by side and overlap, but they also fit into the large-scale data architecture for data and analytics or whatever the scope of your architecture is. So enough said there. So let's go to Slavic. What do you think of first when somebody says architecture?
Well, when somebody says architecture, I really have a little bit of a split brain, I guess, because first and foremost, I think about the system architecture itself. So how do we build the application with underlying data that actually scales, performs, that allows us to do what we need to do from the system perspective. So that's step one, from my point of view. Then we go to the data architecture itself, which is the subset of overall system architecture, in my view. And with data architecture, some of the really important components are, as you said, and very rightly, what data do you have? What are you going to do with the data? And how are you going to process it in a most efficient way? Just to give you an example, at Sky High, we had a big problem of actually processing very large volumes of data. We're processing about 8 billion transactions each day. So very large number of transactions. We wanted to make sure that they are processed as quickly as possible, that they end up in the form that was usable to the end users, and that generate alerts in a very timely manner. So if there was a security breach, security problem, the data, underlying data would actually bring it up and it made it usable. So that's what I was thinking, along the way as an engineer and as a systems architect. Now, when I'm talking right now about architecture, I'm expanding it into the governance of that data as well. So it's not just, how do I process that data? How do I make it available and usable? But how do I ensure that the right people have access at the right time to the right data? And that's just as important as you know, right now, the systems are becoming very heterogeneous. There's not single data store or database that's the source or the destination of that data. You need to bring it all together and move it through the data pipelines. And at every stage of that data pipeline, it's really critically important to understand how that data is governed, who has access to it, who doesn't have access to it, how do you obfuscate it, how do you stay on top of all the requirements, right? Whether the GDPR, CISPA, et cetera, right? I mean, that's very critical right now.
Okay, we're going to hear from Anil, but before Anil comes on, let me respond to Slavic. That's quite a list you gave, and it shows that there's really a lot of aspects, many concepts that have to be assured that they're in place, there's performance, they're quality stuff. And I like the fact that you mentioned something people forget a lot, which is data governance, right? And so, any collection of data needs governance. Well, if it's a large data architecture with lots of data sets and systems, it's going to have really special governance, won't it? One thing I don't think I heard you say was metadata. So, it's hard to even find data for people who want to explore data broadly through the architecture. They need really good metadata, probably business-friendly type of metadata and that sort of thing. But it's a heck of a lot of stuff. So that was a great place to start with Slavic's list. Anil, what do you think of when people say architecture?
Yeah, sure. So being a consultant for most of my life, I think I would like to answer this in like two ways, the way I have interacted with the customers. Okay, the first is the context. Okay, so what's the goal of the architecture? Every architecture has to have some kind of a goal. And so as a consultant, I have always focused on what is the goal. And based on that, what is the end-to-end architecture? Okay, I think sometimes we may talk about data architecture, but we may have to also talk about the integration architecture. We may also talk about application architecture. So I think end-to-end architecture is the goal. And within that, okay, you can define your own architecture. But unless you understand the end-to-end architecture of how you deliver something, it's a challenge to achieve that goal. I think, and a non-technical example is like if you're building a dam, yes, you definitely require architecture build a dam, but You will also require, hey, how do I work with the local governments? How do I work with the federal government? How do I work with the environmental government? So there are other aspects to architecture, so that we should. So I want to consider that. The second thing, and this has been for the last 10 years, my experience. There are two kinds of architecture that come to mind when I talk to the type of company I'm talking to. So I'm talking to a digitally born company like, say, DoorDash or Airbnb or Uber. I know that they're born in cloud and it's entirely different architecture. Or if I'm talking to a legacy 50-year-old bank, okay, they have an entirely different kind of architecture. So those are the two kinds of architecture that come to my mind when somebody says architecture to me.
Well, thank you, Anil. I love the fact that you started by talking about end-to-end aspects of the architecture. And that's something we'll come back here later is when we talk about, well, how do you actually unify this highly diverse data architecture? So you have to get a vision of what have we got end-to-end, just kind of an inventory of systems, data sets, all kinds of processes that work our way through here, a lot of development processes and other ones. And so, there has to be somebody, keeping an eye on the end-to-end. I think of it as the big picture of the data architecture. That was excellent. Thank you, Neil. Let's move on to Gary. What do you think of when they say architecture?
Yeah, so look, as a guy who's been living above the data architecture level for most of his career, the way I think about it is like these are multiple interlacing sort of systems. Like think of it as like a house. You have a plumbing system, you have an electrical system, whatnot, right? And the house isn't complete until you basically have all of those things right. Now, I think one of the big challenges that I think we've faced in technology for the last, 20, 30 years is that we've gotten a lot of people who have become good at being architects, software architects, or figuring out, well, how's the system supposed to work, and and all that, and that's made its way into astute product management or other things like that, generally for a systems level thing. I think one of the things that is starting to become known, but really needs to become more prominent, is the fact that you need somebody to basically be the architect or the person who thinks a lot about the data structure itself, to the points that Anil was making earlier, like what sorts of things should we do with the data, which sorts of things should we not do with the data, and then let those sorts of decisions work backwards into not just the systems that we wind up choosing, but then also the decisions we make as to the technologies we use to tap into that data. And move it around, and governance obviously is an important piece of it as well. So I think all of those things need to be combined in at the end of the day, kind of a data architect or data product manager sort of person who can help organizations navigate their way through. Because as you know, and as we've discussed earlier on here, the number of technology choices is daunting already, right? And it's getting nothing but more daunting with ever new cloud platforms coming out and data access things and observability things and whatnot, right? So all of these things somebody needs to have purview over in order to make sense of. Otherwise, it becomes the spaghetti pile that a lot of people really will find very challenging as things progress.
Gary, I like one of the things you said early on is to step back and think about data usage. So what data does the organization need? What do they need to do with it? And that's where you start. And a lot of times people ask me, so how do I get started designing my data architecture? And I tell them, don't start with the data architecture. Start with the use cases. You got to figure out, what does the business need? What does your employer need? What do your colleagues need? What are specialized departments and user constituencies? What do they need? And then you work from there, just like you said. Then you work backwards from the usage cases into what data do we need to fulfill that? What tools? What conditions must the data be in to get full business value of it? So I love that you started with that. Thank you, Gary. And Tom Nats, you're up.
Yeah, I'll keep mine pretty short. I mean, when someone says architecture, I obviously think analytics. And I actually worked at Teradata for a couple of years, and I think one thing they did very, very well was they had something called the UDA, Unified Data Architecture.
Yes.
And what I liked what they did was, this is why they became trusted advisors. They would have their UDA, but they were like, okay, this is what we see in the industry. They have data coming in, right? Integration layer, machine learning, all this other stuff. So they have this really pretty cool looking diagram, and that would be completely agnostic of Teradata. And then they'd have another one that kind of overlaid, like, this is where we fit into this. And I thought that was pretty cool, because it actually wasn't, you see a lot of architectures out there and they're just company focused. Like, we only live in this little world. We don't know about all this other stuff. Like you were talking about metadata, data governance, all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was really cool. So I try to I try to take that going forward. It's not my little world, just because my company does something like this. I think a true data architect is looking at the entire industry or the entire ecosystem, and then figuring out where the little product fits in. But I think that is the differences between just a product out there and actually something like a trusted advisor. I guess that's my consulting for many, many years coming out. And that's something that Gary could probably chime in on as well, just being a consultant and trying not to just be focused on one vendor or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's great. You mentioned the unified data architecture, the UDA at Teradata. Some vendors are working on, a large scale thing. For example, some of the cloud providers, with Azure, there's the personal link and other link technologies there that help you to link together the many pieces in that architecture. Both Google and Amazon have announced, collections of APIs and stuff like that to help unify their architectures. But a lot of that is kind of API-based unification. With Teradata, they really had an architecture together describing their own products and how they work together, but everybody else's as well. So those are things to look for. We have not yet heard from MarkDiamond. So what do you think of when people say architecture?
I come from a slightly different perspective. When I think of architecture, I think of governance, and specifically information governance, which I should note I believe is different than data governance. What a lot of organizations are struggling with today is what should we save and what do we need to save longer because we have legal or regulatory record keeping requirements. What should we not save? What personal information or what other personal information are we limited? And likewise, if we're going to save it longer than the legal and regulatory period, what is our business justification? I think a lot of data warehouses are in for a rude surprise coming up when they find out that a lot of data warehouses, unless it's obfuscated or anonymized, you can't keep it. And I don't think that message has really resonated. But it goes beyond that. We're also looking at how do we discover stuff? How do we identify sensitive information across the enterprise? How do we make sure that's properly secured? And likewise, not only how do we do data governance like activities of asking big questions for our data, saying, who should we sell to or what should we do, but also how do we leverage our other data for employee productivity and collaboration? That's a huge issue for a lot of organizations. I'm also going to expand the definition of data architecture. When people think about data architecture or that, I like to take an information governance view to say it's not just about structured data. A lot of these challenges also exist in semi-structured data, in emails, other media, in unstructured data. And I think that I tend to look at the big picture of data, not just the applications, the handful of applications out there. So I come from a slightly different information governance versus data governance perspective.
Yeah, that's a great examples you were giving there as well. And again, you're stressing governance. So I think we're probably going to hear governance as a recurring theme here. So, and like I said, some users forget about governance for the architecture and so forth. Any rate, thanks, guys. We got through our first question. Let's shift gears and address a different topics, a different set of issues. And, my basic question is, what do you think are the hottest innovations that can be used in cloud data architecture today? I'm a back-end data guy, so I've been amazed by the explosion of new database management systems. Most of them open source and or cloud-based, right? A lot of great new things out there that the users can avail themselves of. A lot of my works addresses storage. So I think the object storage approach for your basic cloud platforms, I'm very happy that that's become a kind of standard, right? It still has it can handle structured data, unstructured data, semi-structured, a lot more open than say the relational world. So that's the kind of stuff that I think are hot innovations. This time, let's start with Anil. Think about your experience in recent years. What do you think are the hot innovations?
Sure. I think so. So Philip, I think I completely echo like the type of innovation in the databases that we have seen. Okay, that is for the past 3 years. I'm kind of focused mostly on that. So I think the one thing that really excites me and really hard right now is what they call polyglot database architecture. Basically, right database for the right use case. I mean, there was a time in our life when for every data requirement, relational database was the solution. Okay, but now we have document databases, key value time series databases, graph databases. We have all kinds of databases out there, and mostly those are open source, and that is what my company has been doing. So polyglot databases, right database for the right size is a really hot trend right now. The other thing is like our journey to serverless. Okay, I think many people are kind of moving towards from, like we saw this in the infrastructure, from bare metal to VM to containers to serverless, and we are seeing similar things with the database also. So that's another hot trend. Another thing that is directly or indirectly impacts data architecture in general is this AI and ML. I mean, obviously we have a long way to go, but we have the availability of the frameworks and the models makes it a really exciting field. At least it will remain that for next few years, I would say.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for, sort of trailering onto what I was talking about with database management systems. So you're right. There's also a new generation of real-time databases, databases very specifically for time series, for graph, which is very exciting for me, and other areas like geospatial data. So it seems like there's a database for everything. You know, a lot of times these innovations show up in individual small products, and then the big vendors sort of, create their version of that. So we'll see see how many of these find their way into larger database systems. Well, let's see. We heard from Anil. Gary, what do you think some of the innovations are?
Yeah, so Anil, I think you stole kind of the thunder there. I totally agree with the concept that like the right database for the right applications. And funny, we actually have in our materials here, talking to customers, it's always about building the application or the machine learning or what have you on the platform that best suits the need, right? So that is definitely the exciting trend. And the amount and pace of innovation that's going on in that platform, in that area is really profound, right? As we've all talked about, there's so many cool and interesting things going out there that it's definitely going to be interesting to see the things that are built on top of them going forward. I'd say the second thing that I'm like happy about, largely because we live in this space too, is kind of this disaggregation, if you want to call it that, of the ETL space itself, right? So ETL used to be kind of this monolithic sort of thing. And for me, it was always kind of weird that the T was in between, right? Because a lot of the transformation piece of it was kind of dependent upon the use that you would have on it. So what I think we're seeing is that it's starting to break apart. Our space, we're the EL part of it. There's a bunch of other people doing the T part of it, and there's people doing the observability part of it and all that stuff. And what that tells me is that we're starting to take it seriously. And we're starting to really think about, the uses of these data, as we talked about before, and finding, the best patterns to get it out of one place and to put it into another place as seamlessly as possible. So that for me is kind of an exciting trend.
Yeah, been a lot of advancements around data integration in general. So the emergence of pipelining, also in methodologies, the emergence of data ops. Well, let's move on. Tom Nett, what are some innovations that strike you?
I go back and use my age sometimes when I talk, but I remember kind of when strip malls first came out, and this is a long time ago, like when I was really young. But it was like you have to drive to different shops, right? And then you go to a strip mall and you could get a bunch of stuff done in one area. And that's the way I kind of look at the cloud, where before you had everything on-prem and you'd have to get a vendor, bring them in, install their software, get the hardware, all this stuff. And now you're in the cloud, where I did this webinar called Build versus Buy. And we built this product called Starburst Galaxy, which is a SaaS product. So for us, I'm bringing it up right now, for us to actually add in billing and usage, there's a company called Metronome. We literally just send usage to them, and they do all their billing. We use Cockroach for a DB. Like for us to set that up with RDS or something like that, and all the redundancy would be a huge lift. And then we use Datadog, and that's just some of them. I think that's the most exciting thing for me in the cloud is you have these, I call them Chipotle companies. They do one thing, they make a burrito, they do it really well, and then you get to just use them. And not just, I'm talking like Salesforce. These are just specific logging companies or something like that I never thought would exist out there. I thought we'd have to go build all that stuff ourselves. Now, I mean, they saved us probably at least a year of time just using these services out there. And I think that's what gets me excited about. That's the true version of the cloud, is everybody's there and it's an ecosystem, and you can pick and choose. You can fire a vendor, bring somebody else on. I think that excites me.
Yeah, in my head, I think of that as cloud data services. And you're right, there are a lot of new services available out there. Great points. So let's move on to MarkDiamond, and then Slavic, you'll finish us up for this topic. Mark?
So I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here, and it's just I started out my career as a software development engineer working for an old database company called Ingress working on multi-processor database systems. I now have people who are smarter than me that work for me. I'm actually going to say, I think there are a lot of great technologies out there. I think that we're seeing a lot of innovation out there, but I worry a little bit. And here's my contrarian part. I worry about when we're doing the governance component of it, when we're figuring out what to do, that we think that we can sort of sit behind our screens in IT or wherever and put a lot of rules in, and we can either obfuscate data or keep data or not. And I think I actually worry that we're depending a little bit, thinking that technology is going to be the panacea for solving a lot of these challenges. And I think there's a tremendous role for this new technology, but you've got to get out there and talk to the business units. We have to build a consensus. We have to work with different organizations to figure out what the rules are and what they're doing. And so, again, I like technology. I'm a technologist by training, but at the other hand, I worry that we're getting a little bit to thinking there's a technology easy button for a lot of these, when in reality, I'm going to say that's part of the solution, but part of the solution is getting it out there and engaging the business, because you will not be successful, or the business will stop you, or legal will stop you, or privacy will stop you if we can't come to a consensus on what's a sensible approach for a lot of these.
Yeah, I agree. There rarely is an easy button, right? But I also like your actionable recommendation, which is to engage with the business. After all, what we do in IT and other technologies, it's really to support the business. Okay, Slavic, why don't you finish us up? What kind of innovations are you interested in?
So what I really see is, the proliferation of the databases and data systems. And on one hand, this is a great thing because you really have, the best data storage, data processing system for the particular business problem that you're trying to solve. On the other hand, that proliferation makes it really difficult to govern that data. And at some point, you will need an innovation to really try to glue it all together and take the best of breed approach, where you can process the data, with no latency, with petabytes of data stored. But at the same time, how do you make sure that you have the right access for the right people to all of those proliferating data sources? I mean, data right now resides everywhere. And that's part of the problem that people are seeing. It's a great thing because we can access it with no latency whatsoever. We can get to the data very, very quickly. And it's amazing innovation, actually, that happened in the last few years, right? How can you get to petabytes of data without any latency? It's great. But now you can get to petabytes of data without any latency. And the problem is, how do you govern that? And I think the solutions that are coming up right now to really bridge it all together and bring it all together are really exciting.
Yeah, real-time's come a long way. We have new real-time databases out there. The ones that have been around for years, they now actually operate at real-time. They weren't always that zero latency as they claimed. Also, innovations from open source, like I see Kafka used everywhere as the preferred message broker for data applications. But keep an eye on Pulsar. It may offset Kafka eventually. Okay, great points, everybody. I love hearing a wide range of innovations. Well, we're gonna when we start up this next round, we're gonna start with Gary and then Tom. But first, let me give you a little background. So, this is a really broad question. So, my question is, what do business and technology users want or need from a cloud data architecture? And so, you might want to think about it, interactions you have with your customers, whether you're selling products and those customers, or your internal customer from an IT viewpoint. What are they hearing in terms of what they have, what they really need? In other words, what are some of their priorities for cloud data architecture?
Yeah. So the questions to me is, this is a great question from the standpoint that my customers generally intersect with me when they are well into their data modernization journey. Usually what winds up happening is somebody says, hey, we need to go and take data and move it from some transactional sort of place and put it in, for lack of a better term, like a Databricks or something like that, to do machine learning or other things like that on it. And usually what winds up happening is that something has gone wrong, right? What they discover generally is the fact that the solutions that they were trying to adapt, that maybe kind of the legacy or older sort of solutions don't actually scale, or they don't look the way that a cloud solution would look, right? There's a whole bunch of performance attributes or cost attributes or other things that are going to be different when you get into a cloud world. And the solutions that they're looking for, definitely, they're looking for something that doesn't work the way that, let's say some solution that's, 10, 20 or whatever years old works, right? It may work for a good thing, a particular thing, but it doesn't necessarily work for this new use. So that's one thing that is very common in my customers' requests or needs. So the ability to scale and act like a cloud native sort of application or technology. And the second thing is that, and it goes back to what was discussed before a little bit with Tom and some of the other points made, which is, people kind of want the easy button at some level, right? They don't want to necessarily go off and have to build everything from scratch and learn new languages or coding methodologies or other stuff like that. So what we see from our customers is kind of a, hey, can you take some of the coding complexity, so call it low code or no code sort of stuff, out of some of these data infrastructure things that we're doing so that we can be more nimble and active to get these things from concept into production. So I'm seeing a lot of that, and that's really becoming a strong trend and project for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I've seen a lot of migrations of data-driven applications and data sets, et cetera. Seen a lot of migrations to cloud, and something that it's usually a later phase requirement. A lot of times people put off the real-time requirements.
Yeah.
They'll start with the batch and bulk, and then later they need somebody like you who can come in and help them get through phase 3 or 4.
Exactly.
Where they're trying to do real-time correctly.
Exactly.
Okay, good. Tom Nett, what do you think priorities are?
I think, it's when people went to the cloud, I think that's, especially from the end user standpoint, that's when I deal a lot with those type of people, is how can I get things faster? And then more self-service. I think those are the two biggest things. And, how do the cloud should be able to make us fail faster. And then, the shorten the deployment time of either new applications, new data applications. And then the other part was self-service. That was kind of promised 20 years ago. And we kind of got there a little bit, but we didn't really. So I think those are the two biggest things for me, is how do I get things faster, done faster, since I don't have to wait for this 8 months to order servers. And the other thing is, how do I truly get to a self-service? And it goes back to all those other companies out there that do like self-service analytics and that kind of stuff. Is the idea is to be able to separate the compute and storage and be able to start using those tools out there and be able to point to one kind of a data set or agreed data set out there, and then kind of go off on your own, because things have changed. The younger generation knows analytics, they know SQL and that type of stuff. That's changed from when I was starting to do this. Like, people didn't know, barely knew Excel and that type of stuff. So
yeah, that's good. I too see self-service as a pretty high priority. And when you're gathering use case requirements, you should just expect self-service is going to be on that list. So anything that'll support self-service is what people want from the cloud architecture. Did I cut somebody off? Did somebody want to say something? Okay. Well, thanks. And let's move on to MarkDiamond.
Yeah, Phil, I think you said something to begin with, which I really like, which is the ability to have metadata. I think to some extent people are adding metadata. I mean, there's two different approaches. One is sort of heuristically, once it's created, can we figure out what kind of data it is and what's the sensitivity associated with that? That gets difficult. I really like the metadata capture early in the process. But the question is, how well can we do that really at the element level? I think that's going to be increasingly important. Now that gets very complicated as that data moves throughout different applications or through that, especially if we aggregate all that data to different areas. So I'm giving a very hard problem out there. I'll just give a very simple example. I think one of the reasons that Microsoft has been so successful with its Microsoft 365 product is in part because they do that very well, even though it's a limited universe of semi-structured and unstructured data. You can tag and manage the data, and those tags will live with wherever the data goes. I think we need to be able to expand that to other data types and structured data more effectively, because the sooner in the process we can understand what type of data we have, the easier it's going to be for us to manage it. But again, that really requires a new architecture.
That's a great point. I think of it as metadata up front. And a lot of work I've done in recent years is around the data lake. And the way a lake becomes a swamp is that people don't document the data through metadata and other semantics like the catalog.
Yeah.
So I had and in fact, I've met a lot of people who curate data lakes, and when they make decisions about will I allow your data set into my lake, you have to assure that curator that you're going to have adequate metadata from the beginning. So metadata needs to be done early, and it needs to be protected.
A lot of those data lakes, in our view, are polluted at this point because they've got lots of sensitive data in there, and I fear that, with the increasing regulatory requirements, there's a lot of data lakes that are going to have to be drained because it's all polluted, and that's it's manageable. But if we just dump it in there without knowing what we have, I think that's going to be a real disadvantage for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, and again, the data curator helps to avoid data redundancy and data dumping. That's great. Thank you, Mark. Slavic, take us out here. What do you think priorities are for cloud data architecture?
Yeah, so when I think about, what are the business requirements, what business is always looking for, I'm always thinking about things that will never change, right? And some of the things that will never change is I want to access data faster, right? That will never change. And nobody will say I want it slower. I want it cheaper, and I want it easier at the end of the day, right? And in order to achieve all of that, you really need to start thinking about, how do you discover what data do you have? So one is upfront tagging and cataloging it properly, etc. But if that train left the station and we have to actually deal with discovery afterwards, that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that we actually understand what data is where and how do we discover it, and make sure that we understand what is accessible, what is not accessible. And then making that accessibility faster is something that won't change. So access to data faster, granting access to data faster, making sure that the right people have access to right data, and then finally making sure that that data is really performing, right? The databases are performant at the end. So you don't have to wait for minutes, hours, days. I mean, everybody wants everything instantaneously right now. So simpler, faster is not going to change. And
you're right. People have wanted high performance for a long time, but now it's just a de rigueur expectation with cloud. So you're right about that. Thank you, Anil. Let's move on to the next topic here. And this time we'll hear from Tom Nats first, followed by MarkDiamond, and then Slavic. So the topic is really what kind of technologies or best practices are you seeing for unifying a cloud data architecture? And we kind of touched on this earlier. A cloud data architecture has got a lot of components, many different tools, platforms, many data sets, all kinds of solutions accessing all those components. And that can be strewn across on-premises systems and clouds, even multi-cloud. So I think there's a real need for users to think about how are we going to have more than a bucket of tools, right? How are we going to have more than a bunch of silos? How are we going to have these high-value components, but they interoperate with each other? Data moves. That's the thing. Data moves in an architecture. People think about getting it in. Well, it's also how does the data move in the architecture as it gets repurposed multiple times for multiple use cases. So, I think metadata and other semantics, that's one way to achieve kind of a logical unification, virtualization as well. Also, being very careful about your data pipelining and data integration. That architecture can help kind of unite and help that data movement within the architecture. We mentioned the UDA from Teradata, et cetera. So I'll just open it up there. So first off is Tom Nats. What do you see people doing to, whether it's a vendor building it in their product or users with best practice, what do you see people doing to help unify the architecture?
I kind of break, everything down into a couple different categories is like engines, security, data movement. So moving it around, and then the end user tools. What are all the tools out there? I kind of break those down. Like there's more in there, right? There's probably cataloging and stuff like that. But those are the main categories that I see that are people trying to solve. And it seems like you can take a lot of these vendors and put them in that some kind of a category. And then you go down the list of what do you want, and then how do they interrupt with each other? And some do and some don't. And I think that's the biggest thing is what we've seen from the Hadoop world and some of these other hype that I call them is I always ask when where do you want to be in 2 or 3 years? Do you want to be stuck somewhere? And I think people learn their lessons and not only getting trapped in on-premise systems and paying too much money and not being able to move their data, but also like the Hadoop hype, right? Everybody moved it was going to save the world and that kind of stuff, and then they're kind of stuck in there. So I think the biggest thing to me is not only just categorizing those 4 things, but then we're 2 or 3 years from now, things are changing. New cool tools are coming along all the time. Will you be able to use those tools or not? I think that's the biggest thing that I see for especially the unifying data architecture, especially in the cloud. That it's easier to do that and not to get stuck anymore. So
That's excellent. For the sake of time, I'm going to hold my comments. So thank you, Tom Nats. Let's move on to MarkDiamond. What are you seeing in terms of unification technologies, or however you want to call it?
I'm going to hit on the best practice area. I'm going to say that organizations really need to think about having up-to-date records retention or data retention policies. What do we save or not save? Data security classification guidelines. They need well understood discovery processes. They need the ability to do subject access requests for personal information. I think to the extent that you could distill these requirements separately, which you don't want to do, and this was alluded by Tom a second ago, you don't want to bake these into a particular application. What you want to do is have these requirements separate and then have the tools. Then you can mix and match your tools to be able to meet these governance requirements, or at least, and these won't be your exclusive requirements, obviously. Having those separate, too often we define our governance requirements based on the capability of a tool, and we're going to say, no, build our policies first, take a step back, and then we can figure out what's our solution stack to be able to meet these.
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good. Thank you. After Mark, we go to Slavic. What do you think some of the unification techniques are that could be useful?
Yeah, I mean, in my view, the key to unifying the cloud data architecture is to have a really clear understanding of what the organization's data needs are, and to implement the right combination of tools and best practices to support those needs. This may involve working with a lot of vendors, open source solutions, other partners, to make sure that the architecture is flexible, scalable, and able to support the organization's data and analytics goals. It's not an easy task. I mean, you really need to start from, what does business really need? What are they looking for? And what are their goals before you can really provide the unifying solution? In addition to having just technical solution, there are numbers of best practices that one need to implement to really have successful cloud data architecture. And those might include implementing strong data governance and management processes, establishing clear roles and responsibilities for data stewards and users, and ensuring that data is secure and compliant with all the regulations.
All right, good. Let's move on to Anil. What do you think some of the available unification techniques are, and which might be useful?
Sure. So I think the success of cloud and data has created this unification problem, as you're calling it. I think we defined at NetApp and Spot, we define that as cloud sprawl. Okay, I think we have multiple cloud vendors, we have multiple databases, we have hybrid cloud, we have on-prem. So there are technologies everywhere. So how do you kind of manage it, unify that? And we have a tool called Cloud Data Operations. Basically, what it does is you can do DevOps across multiple clouds. Okay, monitor, alerting, right sizing. You can do FinOps, like how do you manage cloud usage? How do you optimize cloud usage and data usage? How do you forecast and how do you budget? And then we have security ops, where threat detection, policy enforcement across multiple clouds. So that's one solution, which is from a technical perspective. But the key again comes back to this intangible, which is how do you change the culture of an organization so that we don't have this problem? And when I say culture is kind of very soft term, difficult to define. But if we go a little bit deeper, okay, we can become kind of a data driven. We can be customer centric. We can be result focused over process focused. We can take some calculated risks. So all those things are also important. I think I would end with a quote which is attributed to many people, which says, I think there was a CEO, he had a plaque on his desk that said, in God we trust, everybody else bring data. So that's the kind of a type of culture. That's a type of culture that is required for you to unify everything. Because yes, there are tools and technologies, but ultimately it's your mindset. And if you don't impact the culture, and if it doesn't start from the top, it'll be difficult to solve that problem using a tool.
Yeah, that's great. I like the top-down approach to unification. Also, some of you keep mentioning governance. Governance can be an important unifying tool. I encourage organizations, when possible, to extend their data governance program to also include data standards. And those standards can be not just about data, how do we model it? What are our techniques, preferred interfaces, et cetera. It could also be standards for how do we select tools? We want to make sure they're very open. We want to make sure they have a history of interoperability with other tools. We want to make sure they have access to the clouds that we think are important, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think that's part of the decision making as well. So for this topic, let's end up with Gary. So Gary, what do you think are some available techniques for unification?
Yeah, so as a guy who is one of the providers of unification for all of this, what I will say is the people who I see doing unification the best are people who have adopted kind of what I said at the start and what we've talked to a little bit through the course of this. And that is to have somebody who's kind of like the data product manager or the chief data person, right? Who really is thinking about, all the things that we are doing with the data and should be doing with the data. And to Mark and Slavic's point, the things maybe we shouldn't be doing with the data, right? And so using some kind of an overall framework for understanding the environment in which they need to operate, because then that allows you to then go backwards and make a lot of the technology choices that you need to make, right? So I think that's an incredibly important role that most companies need to think hard about. And we're seeing a lot more of that type of role emerge in our customers. But it's really an important thing to put somebody in charge of this to build all the constituency so that we have, an appropriate framework, right?
Yeah, the data product manager is a increasingly common job title.
Yeah.
And I know that from surveys we ran at Gartner, but also TDWI. And your point, I think, is that the data product manager really oversees a very broad process. And so that is a kind of unification. I mean, they do gather requirements, so they're talking to the business. They, bring those to the engineering, so they're communicating with them, et cetera, through the whole process. So that's in development, which reminds us, a lot of my questions here have been posed thinking about once things are in production. But you're right, there's all kinds of things that have to happen when things are in development. Development needs greater unification as well. Well, hey, listen, we're doing okay with time. Jonathan will rejoin us in a couple of minutes here. Let me just open the floor. Do any of you want to directly address one of the other folks or address one of the topics that have come up here? Oh no! Don't be shy.
Maybe I have a question for the panel.
Okay.
So what do you think? What do you think about the open source as a force in both cloud and database domain? I think I would love to, because I'm in this field for last few years. I would love to know your perspective. What do you think open source? How is open source going to play a role in both cloud and database technologies?
Yeah. Anyone?
From my perspective, it's pretty simple. Open source is a great way to get experience, build capability, and kind of develop things from scratch, right? Then converting it into something that goes into a hardened production environment. That's a secondary thing, but it's a great way to move the ball forward in your innovation, right?
Yeah. To me, standards and open source in general are really critical. And when you look at the proliferation of databases and data technologies right now, I mean, majority of them are based on the open source and standard type of development.
Yes.
They become commercialized by companies, but they a lot of times start as an open source. And that's where bulk of the innovation, at least in the data space that I have seen, is. I mean, that's where innovation at Privacera is at the end of the day. We come from the open source Apache Ranger community and build our solution on top of that. And that's what made it successful, made it extendable, and allowed us to really leverage engineering, not just within Privacera, but also outside.
Okay,
All right,
gentlemen,
all right.
I will have to cut us off there. It has been a great topic, but so now I would like to invite each of you to give some short self-promotion as we close out the panel, 30 seconds or less. Philip will have you give the last word. So Tom, we'll start with you.
Oh, start with me. Oh, wow. Okay. I kind of already talked about what Starburst does, and I think I alluded to this earlier. I'm not really going to completely pitch Starburst. I think it's more of the people that are listening is what I'm seeing again is we're starting to go down that same route in the cloud again, where people are getting trapped inside of certain, and I talk more analytics, right? They're getting trapped inside of certain very, very large companies. Some of them I call Oracle in the cloud. And I think it's something that just take a step back. And I know it's overwhelming. There's thousands and thousands of vendors and products out there, but always think about, like I talked about before, right? Where are you going to be in 2 or 3 years? And I think we don't do that, especially in the analytics world. We just dive right into something and not think about, and that was the old days of the backup strategy. Are you backing anything up, right? So it's the same kind of thing. We're in 2 or 3 years or 4 years from now, something else is going to come out. Can you go and move around? Can you stay agile in your analytics or your cloud venture? So not much of a pitch for Starburst, but I mean, it just, I think that means a lot to me is not getting locked in and moving around and to different vendors and allowing, so anti-lock-in is basically my message. So.
Great. Thank you. Anil, 30 seconds or less, please.
Thank you. Yes. So I think I believe that cloud and data have become immensely successful. And to paraphrase Peter Parker, with success comes responsibility. And what is the responsibility? Well, the responsibility is to how to manage the cloud sprawl and the database sprawl. Okay, how to manage data across multiple clouds and multiple vendors. And for that, NetApp has a division called Spot, and we have a tool to manage cloud operations. We can manage operation using DevOps. You can manage finances using FinOps, and you can manage security using Security Ops. So that would be my pitch. Thank you.
I guess I'll pitch. I think there is a tremendous competitive advantage for those organizations that can take advantage of data to data, specifically data in the cloud. I, however, think there are a lot of obstacles that we've talked about. Halfway through the project, a lot of organizations are finding themselves stuck. We at Contoral, we have we don't, first of all, we're independent. We don't sell or resell or take any referral fees on any products or technologies. We have everyone from attorneys to privacy expert to records managers to CIOs, CTOs. We have the whole range of expertise, and we can help organizations navigate all of those compliance, risk, legal, business challenges to make sure that you can see that competitive advantage that the data can bring you.
Excellent. Thank you. Gary, you're up.
Yeah, so the website's archeon.io. Look, the way to think about us is no modern or data modernization project is ever going to be successful if you use legacy data pipes and the other technologies that used to connect things up. So we do things in real time from a variety of different operational stores always with transactional integrity. In a way that's designed for people who are adopting the cloud or hybrid environments or other things like that. So if you have a data modernization sort of product and you're trying to figure out how to move things around, come visit us. We'll help.
Thank you very much. Swalik, 30 seconds or less.
Yeah, so at Privacera, we really built the platform that allows you to bring all the data sources together, and it has 3 major components. It really allows you to discover the data. What data do you have? Where it resides? Is it PII data? Is it something that should be protected, etc.? Then you can move on to access, so governing the access to that data in a very streamlined, single pane of glass way. And finally, you can deal with encryption and obfuscation of that data when needed. So it's a single solution. It's available in the cloud or as a hybrid type of deployment. And it works really well for the largest enterprises. Most of our customers are Fortune 100, Fortune 250 type of companies.
Great, thank you. And very quickly, Philip, last but not least.
Yeah, there were topics that came up quite a bit with today's panel. And also, thank you, panelists, for participating. Everybody had really great ideas to share. Data governance came up, and rightfully so, because it's so important. All data needs some kind of governance. When we're assembling data and using it in a different way, which is what cloud data architecture does, then your existing data governance program needs to review the progress of the cloud data architecture and be sure that it is being governed properly. properly. So that's a big one. Likewise, metadata came up quite a bit, and I want to remind people it's not just metadata anymore. There are other
Philip,
approaches of
we'll have to
semantics.
cut you off there.
That's
that
okay.
does it
Go
for
ahead,
our show.
Jonathan.
We are running out of time, but it has been a great pleasure. Time again. Thank you for watching. We hope to see you in just a few short seconds for our next panel, Key Considerations for Evaluating Cloud Data Platforms. Have a